Hello, everyone, and welcome. We'll just give it a couple more minutes just while people continue to join us. So we'll start in about 1 minute's time. While we are waiting, it'd be good to know kind of where everyone's kind of coming from in regards to kind of their background. Are you coaches? Are you L&D, instructional designers, more senior L&D roles? It'd be good to know where everyone's coming from. As with all of the IAM webinars, we like to keep this really practical, hands-on. So it's always good to know who our audience is. So if you drop that into the chats, just so we can get a bit of a view of what your roles are.
Got a couple of things coming in. Got Mick, who is an L&D trainer. Charlotte's an L&D associate. Jennifer's an L&D manager. Deborah's an IT training manager and mentor to the disadvantaged.
Cool.
Emily, career experience manager. That's a new one. I've not come across that one before. We've got, okay, there's too many coming in now, but I think we've got HR managers, we've got learning and development managers, L&D specialists.
Yeah, hello to Mohammed in Iran. That might possibly be our furthest location today. Maybe, I wonder.
Amazing. Yes. Who's an instructional designer? Got professional development manager, learning and development business partner. Brilliant. Lots of different roles in today.
Oh, great stuff. So if we kick this off, then we might get a couple more people still joining us, but let's get going. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar about bridging the gap between coaching and learning. So this is going to be a real impartial view, not kind of a coaching bashing, if you like, but this is going to be that real kind of two-sided view to say, what can coaches do better? What can L&D do better to kind of solve and bridge this gap so that we're all kind of aligned and working to the same goals? Before we get started, let's just do some quick introductions so that you know who your panel are. So my name's Phil Lord David. I'm the product manager for eLearning. My background for the last 12 years has been in the L&D space, a number of different roles between head of learning, strategic L&D roles, and senior instructional designers, as well as being kind of that team leader and coach throughout all of that period as well. So this is an interesting topic for me because I've been on both sides. Tom McDowell, do you want to do an introduction of yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Tom. There will be more Toms to come. Brace yourselves. I'm the senior instructional designer here at eLearning, and my background is, well, originally as a people manager, annoyed at poor quality learning, and then kind of almost 10 years ago now, which is a bit scary, got into the kind of world of learning and eventually L&D and digital learning. And Jen, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. My name is Jennifer Eels-Gasavi. I'm an independent L&D contractor. I actually was working out how long I've been working in L&D this morning, which is quite scary. So it's 25 years this year. And it's everything from first role as a trainer all the way through to managing the kind of people agenda as part of quite big transformational projects. And it's been really interesting to see, you know, what makes a good kind of transformation project, and it's getting that alignment between L&D and management and how we can work collaboratively. So it's collaboratively even. So it's quite interesting to have these types of conversations because it's not a them and us, it's very much how do we work hands in hand. Oh, next Tom.
Brilliant, lovely. Thanks for the intro, Jennifer. Yeah, so next Tom. So yeah, one day we'll do a webinar with all 6 Toms that work for our business. It'll just be the bridging the gap between Tom, and Tom. So yeah, I'm Tom Moore, also known as Tom One. I'm Chief Operating Officer here at eLearning. I've been in sort of L&D or e-learning for 5-6 years now, but my background's more sort of leadership roles and transformation. So I sort of bring that sort of cultural change, process management sort of piece to a lot of these conversations. Just as a quick way of introduction, I see lots of familiar names actually on the webinar, which is brilliant. But for those that maybe just don't know about I Am Learning, very briefly, we're an off-the-shelf e-learning content provider. I guess we see ourselves as trying to sort of simplify the complex world of L&D, and hopefully you'll see that in our presentation today. Actually, we like to pride ourselves in trying to talk plain English, and also to think about sort of not just theory but action. And so a lot of the learning content we create is driven through the sort of the art of storytelling and the power of conversation and the power of visual design, really. So we create an off-the-shelf learning library, but we also offer a complementary platform. And increasingly, we're trying to broaden our sort of product offerings to also be things around L&D consultancy and support, of which doing things like these blogs and webinars is a big part of it, but also complementary tools that exist in the learning space. So we're very much in that sort of arena, I guess, of trying to cut through some of the jargon and cut through some of the buzzword bingo that goes around and just offer a solution that solves real world business problems. So think of us in that content space. That's who we are. So I'll hand back to Phil, and we'll get the webinar started.
Brilliant. So I've just seen that Tom's put into the chat. Please do ask your questions as we go through. We do like to get hands on. So if people take us in a completely different direction that's relevant for you guys, then we're more than happy to do that. So questions as we go, if you've got them. If not, there will be a chance to ask questions at the end as well. So I guess our starting point really is, let's talk about what we actually mean by bridging the gap between coaching and learning. So really what we're talking about here is that kind of space where we've got those challenges where we struggle to get coaches and leadership either coming and attending training or taking our courses, because we get the impression that they kind of know their stuff, that they're industry experts, they're coaching people every day, so of course they don't need to refresh their knowledge. The flip side of that is you kind of got L&D teams that are maybe thinking more strategically and trying to solve kind of broader business problems, and that can sometimes overload the end people that they're trying to coach. But also we then demand their time and for them to suddenly shift their priorities sometimes and say, well, you drop everything despite your operational targets, and now you need to support us. And that's a really challenging place to be as a leader, being pulled in all different directions, not just by L&D teams, but by their senior leaders, by the complaints teams, by customers as well, by their people. So it's a really kind of, I guess, a sticky treacle spot is how I would describe it. And I've felt that pain myself on both sides. So I'd like to start off by, let's just talk about a bit of our experiences then, guys. So what's our experience of this actual kind of position and being in this role? Tell me about a time and how you maybe dealt with it.
I can go first if you like, briefly. I mean, the one that always strikes me, going back a number of years now, I guess, is just that real view, I guess, from leaders sometimes of not giving L&D the respect, or at least not having that sort of balance between leaders and coaches. And I can think of plenty of times, and I've been guilty of it myself from a personal point of view, where, as a leader, I'd sit down with like my L&D business partner and we'd talk about the sort of objectives, and then they'd sort of say, well, kind of what training do you need? And I just kind of roll out a big long spreadsheet, almost like a big sort of scroll that you'd unfold, and it would be, and you'd have ticked every single piece of learning that was an offering, because, and then they'd say, well, what's your priority? And you'd say, well, everything's important. It's just that real world experience of, I think, of teams being separate, of leaders thinking, well, I'm operations and I've got my priorities, and L&D saying, well, I've got mine, and neither the two shall ever meet. And I mean, actually, how it was sold in the end was a real sort of centralization of L&D, but also a view that it wasn't just a kind of them and us thing. It was everyone is all part of that same sort of drive and same sort of operational targets. But I think there was a big cultural gap to overcome as well. I think in terms of, you talk about bridging the gap, there's often a cultural thing you have to overcome that I think has definitely been part of my personal experiences.
Cool. Jen, I know we've worked in the past on kind of a big coaching program. That was kind of how we were initially kind of introduced working together, wasn't it? So I wonder if you could kind of share that experience and kind of that how that program and what it was all about, and some of the key things that you maybe did within that, because that was a great example, I think, of where you really were trying to bridge that gap between, you know, the world of coaching and how they saw it, but also L&D being a function that supports them but doesn't solve all the problems.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and I've been talking quite a lot recently about that collective responsibility. It's not, you know, L&D do something, managers do something. We all should be working together because we're all there to, you know, lead, coach, develop our people, whatever kind of format that looks like. So yeah, with the example you mentioned, there was a real need to make sure that our leaders were coaches, and that there was a real disparity between, you know, what we expected and what they delivered, and the numbers and the amount of coaching that was done was vastly different to what we expected. So we did, you know, create a kind of a real detailed program for the managers on how to be good coaches. And I think management development is so key, but it's what happens after the training room stuff, because, you know, managers have no time. They're so busy. They're juggling all these balls. They're getting more stuff directed from L&D or from, you know, top down. So we really focus not so much in the training room, but that kind of post one-to-one support. So we you know, observed, we videoed, we watched back, we did all the things that managers hate, but actually that was focusing on that key bit out the training room stuff, and giving that in, you know, in the now feedback to the managers, and that support for them really, you know, really heightened that offering. And also it really built trust with the leaders, because they didn't see as L&D in this dark hole somewhere building stuff that they had to kind of deliver or reinforce. Actually, it was a very much you know, hand-in-hand process. And from that, we got a lot of respect, because we were in the thick of it with the managers. We were understanding the challenges they go through with priorities. And we looked at building something that was short, sharp bursts of stuff, but really helped kind of them support their people. And part of that was just making sure we focused on why it was important, and how it saved them time, how it would give them what they needed from their people, and, you know, all the things. We really kind of focused on what was the point of what was the why for them, and that, you know, and I think that's really important, is kind of selling it to leaders of why it's important, and we supported them through that process. So
Great, yeah, and we see a lot at the moment, don't we, about leadership is one of the most important or biggest priorities going into this year. And that's why, you know, we're really focusing ourselves on kind of getting a really good, solid leadership content out there for our customers. Tom, I'd be interested to hear from you, Tom 3, this is, about, because you mentioned in your intro, you know, the reason you got into L&D was just that poor learning experience. So you've kind of been in that position, haven't you, where you don't necessarily think you don't need to do it, but you don't necessarily want to do it because of the way that it's being presented to you. So I was wondering if you could kind of tell us more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was thinking. So it was very much a kind of sales focused environment, very performance focused business. But what we were finding as managers is that the kind of L&D offering didn't reflect what the business was actually asking our people to do. So our business was all about close the sale, customer retention, account management. It's all about momentum. And then we would get training workshops that our people would go to for 2-3 days in a big fancy training center. They'd come back and we'd go, great, what can you now do? And they'd go, oh, nothing. We just talked about experiences for a couple of days. And everyone they had a great time. It was lots of fun. It was very engaging. And perhaps they learned some new theoretical model to apply to it, but they couldn't do anything. They weren't being helped to do their job. And in a performance focused environment, that has kind of two impacts. One, as a manager, you look at it and think, I just gave up a member of my team, putting pressure on everyone else for 3 days and gained nothing. But also they as an employee were in a position where their job and their income was dependent on performance. They just lost 3 days of commission sales, but now aren't generating more income because of the 3 days they gave up. So it kind of became a cycle of negativity towards no one wants to engage with L&D because there's no value to it. And it was a classic example of L&D had their own goals, their own objectives, what was important to them, but they didn't reflect what the business was trying to achieve. And I think there is a point as an industry within learning, and I always try to bear it in mind in future, and it's not always successful because it's easy to forget it, but you've got to set aside the L&D ego, as it were, and say, what does the business need, as opposed to what do I desperately want to do? And I think that's probably the biggest lesson we have to learn as L&D professionals, and we all learn it at very different paces. I know it took me a while.
Yeah, we've fallen into that. We've worked many years, haven't we, Tom, together? And we've fallen into that trap of going big, going bold, because that's almost what we want to do, because we can, because we want to make it new and exciting. When actually, in reality, some of those courses that we built could have been a simple PDF. Or directing somebody to a knowledge base.
And sometimes it's also our job to reel the business in, because it's very big right now for a business to go, we want to go big, we want to go exciting. And actually, sometimes our job is to go, hold on a minute, your people don't want or need that. They want an email. That's all they want. And that's difficult because you're effectively saying, don't give me your money.
Yeah, because time is money, isn't it? At the end of the day, the longer we take to train somebody or take somebody out of doing their job, it is costing the business money. And yes, there's kind of budgets there for development time, and it's usually baked into people's time, but not always. You see plenty of departments, and we speak to plenty of customers where your development is expected to be done in your own time, or it physically can't be done in that office. So you've kind of brought us on nicely then, Tom, to how do we actually stop these turf wars, and how do we align these goals? So when I mean turf wars, it is that butting of heads sometimes. We mentioned that quite near the start, didn't we? That L&D is kind of in this dark corner trying to do their own thing. Operations are seeing themselves as doing something else. And we sometimes come together and then we don't always see eye to eye. We don't talk the same language, maybe. And in some cases, we're not even working towards the same goals, which is baffling when you think about it in a business, but it's easily done. So any views on how we can start aligning kind of these goals? How do we get everyone working together?
I was just going to say that I think in L&D we're very good at talking about quantity. We've done this, we've done this, we've done this, we've done that. And actually that's great, but we really should be honing in the quality. What is the key things, the 3 things that are going to make the boat go faster, as it were, as opposed to this whole suite of stuff. And I think the more that we can get into the quality of what we do, and it has that impact, that the business sees the impact, and actually we can quantify what we've done, that's when we start getting people on side. When we start building all these whizzy things that are great and and don't actually make much of a difference, people have a right to question. Well, you've spent X amount of £1,000, you've done X, Y, and Z, you've taken 300 people offline, blah, blah, blah. So we really have to be clever and think about quality, and what we deliver really links the business objectives, because ultimately that's what operations or the leader should be working towards as well. So it's aligning those goals and making sure we're just not, churning things out for the sake of it. Actually, there's, clear business objectives for what we're actually delivering. I think that's really key.
I think it's interesting because it's the classic space of when we rock up to a board meeting and talk about engagement, and everyone else is talking about money.
It's
quantify that.
Classic vanity metrics, isn't it? We're very good at talking about how many courses we've created, hours of delivery of training, and how many people have taken the course or logged into the platform. But at the end of the day, that means nothing. In reality,
exactly.
that the good potential leading metrics, aren't they? In are we heading in the right direction? We talk a lot about kind of learning or failing fast, or learning quickly, whichever way you want to spin it. And L&D teams can really get this bad kind of rap in the company of being not very kind of responsive, taking a long time to do stuff. And I think that's where we can take a lot from kind of working in a more agile way, not necessarily without a plan. There's still a strategy there, but in a more agile way of saying maybe every 2 to 4 weeks we do these sprints and say, is this still the right focus? And if it's not aligning to those business goals, if it's not having the desired approach that we want using those leading metrics, that's when we can start to change things up and say, you know what, hands up, we didn't get it right this time. What else are we going to do? So yeah, vanity metrics is something I could yap on for ages, but I won't. But you know, it's the classic ROI, isn't it? It's one of the biggest topics that we do struggle about in L&D is how do you prove the return on investment, especially when you've got some of these bigger things like when you're implementing a new platform, which is great. That's a great way to go, but how do you prove that that's had an actual impact on the business? And I think that's where we kind of get these turf wars, don't we? That we can't actually tangibly say to the business, our stakeholders, our leaders, and say, this is why we're doing it. It's not just to give people access to learning anytime, anywhere, any time of the day whilst you're in the bath. It's actually to give people access to great content that's going to improve their performance. And it's changing that language, I think, isn't it?
Totally, because if you think about leaders are talking about performance, that's their metrics. So us, talking about the fluffy L&D stats doesn't make any difference. And you're trying to build that rapport and engagement and work with them, not against them. So we need to be speaking the same language, and that's how you take L&D from order taker to strategic partner, and that's the difference. It's talking the same language, it's being at the table, it's being involved and understanding actually what leaders want to see, not the fluffy stuff that sometimes are really we can dip into, which doesn't really make any sense to anybody else apart from L&D people.
And Deborah makes a good point just on the chat channel here about sometimes as well. I think it's not just about, as you say, talking the same language, but also maybe not being afraid to use the voice of the business. So I just quite like the point that Deborah made here on the channel, where she said that she found a champion in their sales team who went to the board and spoke about how much had been achieved, and it was down to the training that had been delivered. And I think sometimes there's nothing more powerful than the business hearing from the end users. I mean, we see it all the time sometimes when people take our content, for example. There's that difference between what perhaps someone that's maybe in the finance team might say in terms of the cost, but actually the end user and what they feed back. It's that real world feedback. I think that's really important. Sometimes the voice of that business is really powerful and will help, cut through some of these turf wars, if you like.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks for that point, Deborah.
I want to kind of go back to the order taker point as well, because that's always a good topic to discuss. How do you often people come to us as an L&D team and say, I want a 2-hour intervention, a workshop, an e-learning, whatever that might look like. And they've already got in their head what they want it to be. They already know what content needs to go into it. And we kind of do this training needs analysis, and we, again, potentially butt heads of saying, no, I want it to be a 2-hour workshop, that sort of stuff. So how do we stop that happening? How do we work with a request backlog? Because often L&D teams have a big old backlog of training requests that come in that's never ending. How do you prioritize it? How do you actually say, no, that's not the right solution, but we would recommend X intervention, or in some cases, it's not an L&D problem?
I mean, I think the start of it is you have to start with an acceptance that people aren't going to agree with you all the time. And at least initially, there's going to be friction in the conversations, and to not be afraid of that, because you're going to be saying no to people. And no one's ever going to go, wow, that was just what I wanted. Thank you. I just put this request in so you could say no. But actually taking the time, not just to go, no, we're not doing it because it's not a priority, but to actually, if you are aligned, and that's the key thing. If you already align to the business priorities, it's very easy to say no. Because if the CEO has said these 3 things are what the business needs to do in the next 6 months, well, if it's not one of those 3 things or feeding into them, the CEO has just said, we're not doing it. There's your answer. You're not saying no, the business is saying no. But to do that, you have to already be aligned. I think that's the biggest benefit of doing that initial bit where you give up your L&D ego bit and you go, we're here to support the business or help the business achieve. If your request doesn't help us do that, then we can't support your request. You have to set that as the expectation.
And I'm a big fan of opportunity mapping. That I find that's a great way to kind of align everything back. And it's similar to kind of action mapping, but I guess it's more high level. It's not necessarily in the nitty gritty. Opportunity mapping is looking more about not necessarily has somebody come to you with a performance issue, but what is the opportunity just to improve things on the whole. I won't go into opportunity mapping too much because it's a big old topic in itself, but I'd highly recommend looking at opportunity mapping, especially if you're in a more strategic kind of senior role where you kind of need to decide, do we implement an LMS? Do we bring in content? Do we do X training requests now or in 6 months' time? Because like you were saying, Tom, that's a really great way of actually saying, well, here's our current kind of chances and opportunities aligned to business goals. Does your new request help add value to that? Is it a new opportunity, or is it just something that's actually in the existing one and maybe we need to change tact as well? And going back to that agile point, that's where getting together every 2 to 4 weeks, maybe with the key people, both stakeholders, senior leaders, you can have that discussion and you can say, well, this has come in. Is it the right priority? Is this having more of an impact? In which case, let's drop everything and maybe or park everything and go and solve this problem because it's going to have a bigger impact on the business. So how can we get leaders then more involved in learning? So we've talked a lot about kind of what L&D can kind of do to bridge the gap and stop this kind of turf wars. But I think there's a lot more that we could be doing as L&D people to get either leaders involved or equally getting them more excited about learning as well, and not necessarily that they don't know everything, but them realizing that them themselves need to keep on top of their own development. So what's our thoughts on this question?
One thing I've done consistently whenever, because ultimately to an extent you're also talking about getting people to think about what the future could look like and the transformation around that. And I know one thing that I've used time and time again when it comes to that piece is almost like a sort of a day in the life kind of view, where you kind of get leaders to think about what they want tomorrow or any points in time, almost like state mapping, where you could sort of say, well, actually, where do we want to be in 12, 18 months time? That could be predicated around your operational targets or regulatory targets or whatever they might be. And it could be further. I mean, we've done sort of 3 to 5 year views in the past. And then you step back from that and say, well, actually, that's quite a lot to take in. So maybe where will we be if it's just, say, 18 months time? Where will we be in a year? Where will we be in 6 months? Where will we be in 3? And even if you could, maybe there's key roles that you can build this around.
Don't know if we've lost Tom there.
We may have.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, cool. We'll see if he joins back up. Joys of hybrid working, of course. So, Jen and Tom, have you got any thoughts on this? And we'll see if Tom kind of comes back.
I was going to say that I think when when L&D is building a program or building a solution to the business, need or requirement, there needs to be that thought about, how do the managers or leaders actually reinforce that? Because sometimes, L&D starts something and then we kind of fling it over the wall and say, right, get on with it. And it's about having that, again, that collective responsibility. So, if you're building a program, bringing the managers and leaders in to actually support you in building that. So you're building something that meets the time constraints, their responsibility, juggling all these balls again. But also making sure they're comfortable with the content, because they might be part of delivering it as well. So it's a real collective approach. But also, if we've delivered something, actually, how does that, making sure that leaders can reinforce that and continue what we've started? It's not a them and us. It's really focusing on working hand in hand, because we've all got that responsibility, as I've said, to support the individual. So I think it's looking at a program at a bit of a higher, kind of more holistic level of how do we bring the leaders in and they feel part of what we're building, to allow them to continue what we've started. I think that's really key.
I think that kind of goes to whether you're an instructional designer or a learning designer within a business. Whenever you're designing a solution, coaching and support should be part of your design, not something that happens after L&D's involvement, as you were saying. I think that's really key. But I also think it's probably the most challenging change that would be needed, because within pretty much every working model that different designers and developers will use in L&D right now, that stage is just completely missing. We kind of jump from deploy your solution to evaluation. as if somehow evaluation inherently supports people. It doesn't. It helps us. In that sense, our ways of working are very inwardly centric. And I think we almost have to put a break in there and say, well, actually, this is the part where when you're designing your solution, you need to think, yes, we need an e-learning and we need a workshop and we need some PDFs. Oh, and we need coaching, which is going to cost X amount. And especially when you're talking about leadership level, this is the most expensive time to buy in your business. If you're talking about a senior leader, just on a per hour basis, to put it really simply, they're going to be on potentially double what your average learner is, which means from a business perspective, you're spending twice as much for every moment you're taking up. And you need to be able to account for that. So I think it's including it in that design, but also being very aware that your coaching is an expensive resource and you need to represent that and value that when you're talking to the business about it, not just say you need to coach your people, which we've all probably experienced at some point. Just coach your people, just do it, make the time. We need to go, actually, we're asking you to effectively create a high value L&D product. So we're going to support you in that, whether that's skills on how to coach or what can we do to save you time in your job to make room for it as part of the design of the solution, rather than trying to do it on the fly afterwards.
Totally. And I think that's where our expertise come to the fore, isn't it? That we, having that longer view of a plan and making sure that the coaching part's built in, but also we're giving the coaches and leaders the tools to be able to do it as well. And I think that's really important. Sometimes I think I go into businesses and still assume that managers can coach properly, and sometimes they're so in the thick of it and focus on the kind of they're working in it, not on it. So we need to really make sure that we're supporting our managers. And I was going to give an example of when I worked for a media company, and we rolled out some coaching training for our leaders. And what we realised is we were training sales managers and in their own sales teams. And they were doing it like having a coaching session in a car, because they were out in the field. There was no paperwork. There was nothing there to actually prove that conversation had happened, and anything for the learner to take away to action or do something with. So as part of that program, we needed to support the managers with the tools to be able to do the coaching effectively. So we actually looked at building a coaching portal that allowed them to go and use their iPad, log in, fill out some information with the individual on a one-to-one basis. They click submit, it would send a copy to the individuals. They've got an action plan that came out the back of it, and it helped continue that conversation. But also just gives a bit of structure around about it as well. And from an L&D perspective, we could see all the coaching that was happening, all over the UK, to allow us to pull that really great, rich data about, what do we have to intervene in this area, or what are the kind of key training needs that we have in certain areas and certain people. So that was a real win-win, because we listened to the managers about, it's great giving them the training, but we can't do it properly. We don't have the tools. So working hands in hand to give them the right skills and the tools to be able to coach effectively is going to help your program. It's going to help land that program of work that we've spent a lot of time putting into place. And that was really effective. So that's definitely something to think about as well.
I like that example as well, because going back to kind of the opportunity mapping, if you were to look at just at the top level surface problem, you probably would have ended up with this big old training program about effective coaching and all sorts, and e-learning and supporting materials and the lot, when actually all they needed was the tools to do it better. They just needed somewhere to document it, or some small guidance. So that's a great example, I think, where actually by doing the investigation work properly and understanding what their needs are, rather than what we think or what we want to do, we've saved a lot of time, money, and it clearly had a great impact there.
Yeah.
So there's some really great stuff in the chat, actually. Simon's asked, would you say that the type of org structure is important in this? Most companies seem to have L&D built into HR functions, but he's also worked in a company where L&D were separate, and that L&D managers sat on the senior leadership team and influenced directly without the extra layer. So I think everyone's got a different opinion on L&D as part of HR, haven't they? And whether or not they're in fact anything to do with each other. But I guess any particular input from anyone that they would like to share at the moment?
I guess I would start from just more of a personal experience point of view, really, is that, I think org structure can definitely influence all of this, because it can get very hierarchical, political, and even on a senior leadership point of view, you kind of get this, I guess, ego leadership, don't you? Where you do say, I'm higher than you, therefore I make the final decision. And I think there needs to be that, regardless of any org structure, the best way to do that is a two-way communication, and potentially start looking at the likes of kind of what are dubbed as product trios. And rather than one person making a decision, it is a collaborative decision made at it, whether that's an SME, the L&D team, the person that's put the request in, or someone from HR, whatever that might be, because everyone's coming at it from different angles, has a different viewpoint, and has a different, not necessarily priority, but direct kind of priority, if that makes sense, within their role. So I think when you take all of those views and then you put maybe 3 ideas in the pots or something like that, and come to kind of this inclusive decision, that's when you can kind of kill any kind of org structure and actually start working all together. That's my view on that.
I've seen it work both ways. I think sometimes, personally, I think there's sometimes a bit of a disconnect between HR priorities and L&D, or they don't really understand, which it shouldn't be, because we're all working towards the same thing. But where I've worked before, that L&D is really formed a part of the operations or the sales teams, and that has its pros and cons, I have to admit, but I think it just gives you that extra level of credibility, because you're in the thick of it, you understand the day-to-day, you understand the pressures, the issues. And like that example, the coaching portal, because we worked so closely with the leaders and the sales team, we were able to create something that really they wanted and they needed. It wasn't us building something away in a darkened room. It was exactly what they required at that point. So there's pros and cons for both, but I think in general, the more you're aligned to the people, the audience you're delivering to, the much better the output of what you deliver is going to be, because you are building something not for what L&D thinks is pretty and funny and whizzy. Actually, it's what the business requires, whether that be a PDF or an animation. It all potentially gets the same outcome. So it's giving the business exactly what they need, really.
I think this is, well, Phil, just to finish off my perspective, I think this is where you can flip not just what L&D or leadership can do and how they can get more involved in learning, but what can leadership do for L&D? Because I think organizationally and all the org structure definitely has an impact, but also I think if leaders at a senior level don't value L&D and what it can bring, then you're kind of fighting a losing battle. I've been in organizations where the kind of key leaders really talk about development and L&D and learning and that learning culture, and that really makes it an easy job. It almost doesn't matter where that function sits organizationally, it's part of the culture and DNA of the business. So I think that's what leaders can help L&D with a lot of the time.
Yeah, and I think maybe more, just thinking about it, more so than org structure, is kind of team size of your L&D team. Because if you've got a one-man band and you're working on your own trying to deliver everything, you almost don't have that time or that seat at the table to go and talk to leaders. So you do almost have that, or need that person that can talk more strategically and feed that down into the team. I think that's probably the hardest battle for any L&D team when you're quite small, but trying to solve and serve the entire business. So maybe more than org structures, the business should be looking at the size of the L&D team, and that comes back down to value, doesn't it? How much value do we see in investing in people and resource into this and the different skill sets they need in that team, rather than a single person trying to be a graphic designer, SME specialist, strategic person, instructional designer, the lot. And it's a lot of skills for a lot of people. So we can talk about this for quite a while, but let's go on to the kind of final question. We've got about 5 minutes left, and then we'll see if anybody's got any more questions. So L&D teams, what can we do to support leadership and coaching then. So we've talked about how we get leaders more involved in the training. What can we do in reverse of that?
I think a big thing here is, certainly from my perspective, goes right to onboarding. Like a lot of, increasingly, we're seeing leaders and managers hire direct position from outside of businesses, which is great because we get lots of cross-pollination of ideas. But it also means that unless you've got a really strong management and leadership onboarding program from day one, people are coming into your business and being asked, coach. Maybe they've never coached before. It's a big assumption. Maybe the business they've come from doesn't engage in that kind of thing. So actually just not assuming that everyone has that skill set. Starting really basic, giving them tools, but also giving them tools that actually respect the fact that their time is limited and their time is expensive. So don't just give them 20-minute e-learnings on coaching skills because, well, how many of us would want to sit through that? That's an easy question, isn't it? Whereas this is one of those few categories where you think the modality of a quick article link, curated content rather than created, things written by industry experts as opposed to your L&D team, their peers as opposed to you as the expert in inverted commas. Will be much more impactful and more related to how they want to consume content. This is the group of people who will read HBR articles, that will listen to a podcast on the car on the way home, as opposed to your frontline employees who realistically, it's not fair to ask them to do that because this may not be a career job for them. So I think that from day one, that's the biggest change I think we could make.
And it's a great time saver as well, if anything. We're time poor as a team, so why not leverage all the great content that's out there? I mean, if you're going to create a course, you're probably using those resources anyway to help shape your content, so why not just give them the source material, and rather than linking it at the back end of your course when they could have just gone straight to the source. I'm a big fan of adapting or giving different people potentially different types of intervention, even if it's maybe for the same topic. I guess going back to kind of that time is money factor, it is a lot of effort, time, and a big chunk out of somebody's day to go sit in a training room for 2 hours and take the same training. So could you provide them something else that still gives them the skills and the knowledge, but is maybe 2-minute reads here and there, so that they can fit that in between maybe customer callbacks or trying to do some coaching? And yes, it's more design debt for the L&D team, but if it's more effective, you stop the rework down the line. So it's trying to put the effort up front rather than going in a continuous circle.
I mean, that's effectively, it's learning clusters, as opposed to what we've historically done, which has been maybe, let's say, a blended approach. It's thinking about creating clusters of content that you can pick and choose from to gain competency, rather than saying everyone must do these 5 elements to be competent. I think the adaptability it gives your content and the longevity you gain from that actually saves you time in the long run.
Totally. I think
go, Jennifer. Go.
Thank you. Just following on from what Tom said, that I think it's really important giving people what they need, and I think that's a real key part of it. But I think that the better management programs I've observed or been part of are the ones that you get that kind of cross-pollination of leaders across the business as well. It's not just all IT or all operations. Actually, they can discuss, because management issues or concerns or challenges are probably pretty much the same across different areas of the business. So giving managers a chance, now I'm not saying bring them all into one training room and have an action learning set for 3 hours, but have something that allows to share ideas, share best practice, share examples that they can all feed into and learn from. I think it's really powerful, and that takes it away from training or L&D telling you what you should be doing. Actually, it's real examples of what's worked for people in the business. So again, that just kind of elevates the learning, because it's not all L&D's version of the truth. It's actually we're sharing ideas and sharing knowledge as well, which I think really I have seen working before as well.
Yeah, all I was going to say that and just a bit, you said that at the start there, Jennifer, when you said kind of give people what they need. I think sometimes people don't know what they need. And I guess it's just that bit around asking why and the kind of 5 whys of user research. And just, I think we were chatting about this the other day and saying it's not just also asking why, it's making sure you're asking the right person why and the right people having that conversation. Because I think it is about drilling into something to really make sure that what they think they need is actually what they need, and maybe is also solving the problem that is the root of that underneath. And that takes a bit of investigating rather than what might be on the surface.
I can't remember exactly who it was from. I think it was Henry Ford. He said if you asked people what they wanted many years ago, they would have said a faster horse, not a car. Yeah. It was something like that. So, people don't always know what they actually need. They might tell you what they think they need, and that's where it's kind of down to us to get to all of those root causes, dig deeper and say, yes, we could just do this, but actually would this that nobody's thought about, nobody's asked for, would this be actually a better solution that's going to have more impact than what somebody thinks they might need? I'll find the quote and I'll dig it out somewhere.
Yeah, no, it was Phil. If Henry Ford, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses.
Yeah, there you go. And it's kind of a nice way to kind of, I guess, lead on into any questions that people might have, really. So we bang on 45 minutes. I am a stickler for timekeeping. What can I say? So I'd like to throw this over to the audience and see if we've got any questions coming through on the chat, anything that people would like to drill down into anymore.
We've not got any questions at the moment. We've had a bit of a chat about Deborah's mentioned she uses 7 taps when creating clustered content. Sue's just said it's important to provide a scaffold, and where I've experienced a successful coaching approach, the 70-20-10 model has been a great approach on the job shadowing and mentoring. So if you've got any questions, everyone, now's the time.
While we're waiting to see if any questions do come in, I'd like to kind of go around to everyone and say, what's your one biggest tip or bit of advice to try and solve this problem? So let's start with you, Tom 3. What's your one tip to take away from this?
I think it would be set aside the L&D ego, focus on what you can do to support your business by including coaching, mentoring, whichever one you're going to have within or both in your program design, rather than doing the shiny thing that you think will be most fun.
Brilliant. Jen, what's your biggest takeaway?
Oh, there's quite a few, but if I had to push me for one, I would say it's that collective responsibility. It's not the training does everything, L&D does everything, or managers do something. It's having that view of what can we collectively do as a leadership team to support our people. And I think that's really key.
Brilliant. Tom 1, what's your biggest takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, it's not my takeaway per se. I'm going to steal it from you, Phil, but I think we say it every webinar. And I think it's always worth saying, because I think we talk around the fact that, L&D have that seat at the table now, but actually when you have that seat at the table and we're now part of this conversation, the skill set that L&D people need to be able to influence and negotiate is different. And you often say, for example, L&D are great at a lot of things, but one thing they're not great at is writing like a one-pager that summarizes a business case. So there are new skills out there and I guess it's that old cliche that practice what you preach. And maybe we should often also think about what personal development L&D people need to help them navigate through this, what is becoming an increasingly complex environment. So don't forget those new skills that I think we need to take on board.
Great.
Sure. And we have some questions.
Yeah, I'm just going to cheat a little bit because I'm going to give 2 takeaways, but one's actually relating to one of the points in the chat. So my biggest takeaway would be learn more about opportunity mapping, because it's a great tool for anybody in a strategic role. And I did see somebody asking about leading metrics and where you can learn a bit more about that. I mean, there's great stuff online if you just type in leading versus vanity metrics. I personally would, it's almost pre-rehearsed, but this book here, the product book, that's one of my go-to books, and there's a great section in there all about vanity versus actionable metrics. It is aimed at kind of the product market, but I'm a big fan of having a product mindset in L&D anyway. So it's got some great tips in there. I think if you just read that book in general, you'll find some great tips and advice and a lot of kind of correlations between creating products that make real impact on business and your end users.
Got a question. It's actually from our own Gemma. Can we develop, or can you develop great coaches internally, or do you need to look externally to get that expertise into the business first? Interesting question.
Who wants to take that one?
And I'm happy to kick things off, but people may disagree with me.
Go, Tom.
Go for it, Tom. Go for
the
it.
most effective coaching training I ever got when I first became a manager was provided by an external company who specialized in coaching training. I think it depends who you have in your business. That's the thing. If you already have great coaches, then they can train or can help other people become great coaches, because becoming a great coach is not purely a training exercise. That's the thing. It's a very practice-based skill. You will be terrible at it at first. Just accept it, roll with it, and get better over time. And that's maybe where training doesn't always provide the support that's necessary. But in my experience, I found it was very specialized training that was required. So there will be companies, I think, that have to hire externally, but then once you've got great coaches, then you can do it internally. You don't necessarily have to hire people in. You could just hire in the initial support to develop your people.
Yeah, and I think I'd agree with that, to be honest, Tom. I think, like you said, it depends on who you've got in the business. Because if you've already got people in there, as long as they've obviously got the time to do that coaching and mentoring, then brilliant. But why not leverage internal knowledge and internal skill sets where you do have it? And if not, then look to external providers. It's no different to looking to a platform provider to provide you with your LMS, or to a content provider, or to somebody to create maybe some a whole face-to-face kind of onboarding program for you. Leverage the skills that you've got, because we can't do everything as an L&D team. And I've definitely fallen foul of this in the past, of being resistant to kind of external vendors and stuff like that, and thinking, it's cheaper, we can do this ourselves. Yes, we can, but we don't necessarily have the time to do it. For us to create a full program, that's going to take somebody out for maybe 6 to 7 months, and then you've got to deliver it. Somebody might have that on hand to bring into your business, and then you can focus on the more specific stuff. So yeah, definitely leverage the two, I'd say.
And I'm just going to add to that, I think we've all worked in L&D for a long time, and L&D facilitation skills are very different from coaching. So I've met amazing facilitators, but I wouldn't say they're the best coaches. So I think you're right. There is that focus of buying things in that your team can't provide, because again, that gives us a gravitas that we are, sourcing the right solution for the individual or for the leader. So it's just something to think about. Are we best placed to build a course on coaching? Maybe we get it from outside. Who knows? Pros and cons for both.
Mm-hmm.
Last question that I can see is from Trudy. She's a big fan of the 70-20-10 model. Not everyone here is, I'll tell you, but struggle with the 20 now that all our staff are remote. Any tips on how to make this happen?
I would say first point would be speak to your end people, and map out everything of what are their challenges that do this, and all of those kind of challenges, make sure you write them down from the view of the end user. So for example, it'd be easy to say like they can't access content, they can't access people to talk to, whatever that might be. If you word it in the way of the end user of and this goes for any kind of challenge, by the way, of saying, I can't access this, and then you start drilling it down, or I want access, or I want to be able to speak to other people. And then from there, you start branching down into those child opportunities of saying, who do they want to speak to? Why do they want to speak to those people? So start talking to your people, do some user research, find out what their pain points are and their challenges. It might be that they don't even need that sort of stuff. If they're performing well and they're doing their job well, then don't create something that doesn't need to be created.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was touching on. Is I think sometimes it's easy to obsess using a model like 70-20-10 that you must apply it to everything. Whereas really we want to be saying, is there a problem? And then how do we aid its solution? And as long as that's done, doesn't actually matter whether it conforms to that model versus this model versus another model. It's about, are we achieving? And if the answer is yes, leave it alone. Unless there's improvements you can make that will actually be useful. But don't worry so much about compliance to one model, I would say.
And the thing is the 70-20-10 actually achievable? I don't know about anybody else. I've not worked in a company that would say, right, we do this really well. So there is a bit of a blend to be had. And if you're, aligning to business objectives and giving people what they need and what they want at the right time, then, it might be a bit of more of a blend of that than this has to be 70, this has to be 20, this has to be 10. Maybe a bit more fluid than that.
I think across the board, models are good and a good starting point and a good way to get maybe an initial understanding. But I think across the board, don't stick to them and don't cling to one model. Go out there and learn more ways of doing things as well. And that's not to say that they're wrong, but it's, that's the ideal world, the happy path. And unfortunately, the real world doesn't always work in a happy path model. Use that as a basis. And that goes for everything that we're saying on this webinar. Use this as a basis of doing more research, finding out more about what we're saying. And does it work for you? What can you take away that will work for you in your business? Because some of this stuff just purely won't work because it's just the nature of the beast. So as with anything, the caveat that we always say is we are not 100% correct. We are purely voicing our experience and our knowledge on this topic. So please use this as a sounding board to go away and do more research and find out what works for you. Tom, have we got any more questions, or was that the last one?
I'm not seeing any more questions. Any model should be, I think Sue's just come in there. Any model should be a scaffold or guide as opposed to a rule.
Absolutely.
Or scaffold.
Yeah.
No, you just say while Tom's looking there, because there are ways to create informal learning now, even though, aren't there? Even with this whole remote situation, I've seen stuff like people doing almost like remote sort of virtual book clubs, but more around learning content. I've seen people doing onboarding where they set up a structured onboarding virtual tour for people so that they're introduced to the network in the same way they would be if it was a more physical, sort of tour. I've seen people set up Slack channels. I've seen organizations doing more sort of, weekly, meetings, again, virtually, but getting kind of people to turn cameras on or do them as stand-up meetings. Lots of different ways. I think you can probably still, as you say, it's not about the percentage, but there are ways that I still think you can do that informal learning through the technology that's available to us today.
Brilliant. So we're just about out of time with a couple of minutes to spare. So I guess the final thing that I'd say is feel free to get in contact with any of us. You connect with us on LinkedIn. We're more than happy to continue these conversations, or if there's anything that you want to find out more, we'll happily point you in the direction of either somebody else in our network that can help, or kind of come together as a group. Do check out the I Am Learning Content website. We often post on there blogs, podcasts, and there's always new webinars as well, all about hot topics. So go to there and use that as a source of knowledge as well. And of course, if you want to get into contact with I Am and learn more, you can get in contact through our website, but also our telephone number is on the screen as well. So I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you to all of our panel as well for taking time out of your days as well. I think it's been a great conversation, and this recording will be available on the website as well afterwards for anybody to watch on demand as well. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.